My husband announced it casually, as if the words didn't hold the weight of 10 forgotten years. "My ex is coming to Christmas dinner with us," he said, and something in his voice made the room colder than the snow outside. I didn't know it then, but that night would tear open secrets he never meant for me to find. Clara spent years building a quiet, steady life with her husband, Matthew, and their teenage son, Oliver. Their home sits near a wooded edge, where winter winds seem to whisper things people don't say aloud. Matthew has always been gentle, predictable, careful with his words, a man who avoids conflict like broken glass. So when he announces that his ex-fiancée, Rowan, will join them for Christmas dinner, Claire feels the first hairline crack in the world she thought she understood. The house was quiet when Matthew mentioned her name, the kind of quiet that lets a single sentence echo like a dropped stone. I was drying the dishes, listening to the soft tick of the kitchen clock, when he said it so casually I almost missed it. "Rowan's coming for Christmas dinner." For a moment, the plate slipped in my hands. I didn't turn around. I just watched my reflection blur in the window, the winter tree branches shivering behind me. Something inside my chest clicked shut, like a door I hadn't opened in years. I breathed slowly, smoothing my voice before it escaped me. "Rowan." He didn't answer right away. He was tying his shoelaces, back bent, shoulders tight. The kind of tightness that doesn't belong to a simple invitation. Oliver looked between us, his small face folding with a question he didn't know how to ask. Children always feel the tension before the adults admit it exists. Matthew cleared his throat. "She has nowhere else to go." Those words hung in the air like frost. I waited for him to look at me, to offer some explanation hidden behind the gentle reason he'd rehearsed. But he kept staring at the floor, pulling on his boots as if the laces had suddenly become complicated. I wiped the same spot on the counter over and over, listening to Oliver shift in his chair. He sensed it, the invisible crack between us widening. I wanted to ask something simple, something harmless, like why now? But my mouth stayed closed. My heart had its own reasons for waiting. After he left the room, the silence expanded. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I walked to the window, watching the faint trail his truck left in the thin layer of frost. Oliver came to stand beside me, leaning his head against my arm. His breath fogged the glass. "Mom," he whispered. I touched his hair, smoothing the curls back. "What is it, sweetheart?" His eyes lifted to mine with a softness that made my throat tighten. "You looked sad when Dad said her name." I didn't mean to let anything show. I didn't mean for my son to carry what wasn't his. So I forced a small smile, the kind that doesn't fool anyone but buys a moment to breathe. "Just surprised, that's all." But inside me, memories stirred like dust rising from a box I'd never planned to open. The day stretched, slow and heavy. Every room felt colder, like the house itself remembered something I had tried to forget. I kept replaying Matthew's expression, the downward tilt of his head, the way his fingers lingered on the shoelace knot, the quiet apology hidden in the line of his shoulders. It wasn't just guilt. It wasn't even regret. It was fear of something unsaid. As evening settled in, the golden light softened the edges of the furniture. I moved through the house, straightening pillows, folding blankets, anything to keep my hands busy. The quiet made my thoughts louder. Rowan had been a name I learned to step around like broken glass. Years may have passed, but the shape of certain wounds stays sharp. I found Oliver on the couch, coloring. He glanced up when I entered, but didn't speak. Children know when to leave the air undisturbed. The rising moment came like a whisper, not from outside, but inside myself. A quiet realization. Matthew hadn't invited Rowan out of kindness alone. There was something else, something deeper, pressing at him. Something he didn't trust himself to say. I sat down beside Oliver, my fingers brushing the edge of his paper. "Did your dad say anything else this morning?" He didn't look up. He kept coloring, but his voice softened. He just looked nervous, like when he had to tell Grandpa he lost his job that year. A shiver ran through me. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the truth settle like a heavy coat across my shoulders. Something was coming. Matthew felt it long before he spoke her name. Later that night, When the house was finally still, I sat on the edge of our bed. Moonlight slipped through the blinds, striping the floor with pale silver. I listened to Matthew's footsteps in the hallway, too slow, too hesitant. He stopped in the doorway. "You're quiet," he said softly. I didn't turn to him. "So are you." A long silence followed. He exhaled, a breath that sagged under its own weight. "I know it's strange. I know it's asking a lot." My voice barely rose above a whisper. "Why now, Matthew? After all these years, why bring her back into our lives?" He didn't answer. He didn't look at me. He just rubbed the back of his neck with a trembling hand, the kind of gesture a man uses when a truth sits too heavy to lift. In that quiet turning point, the ache inside me sharpened. Not from jealousy, not from fear of the past returning, but from the knowledge that something wasn't being said, something that had nothing to do with Rowan herself, and everything to do with the way Matthew's voice cracked when he said she had nowhere else to go. I watched his silhouette linger in the doorway before he finally turned away, leaving the darkness between us untouched. When the house fell silent again, I pulled the blanket up around my shoulders. The room felt colder, as if the night pressed closer to the windows. I listened to the soft hum of the heater, the faint rustle of branches outside, the steady breathing of my sleeping child down the hall. The closing scene settled gently, like snow beginning to fall. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint cracks with my eyes. My heart beat quietly, but insistently, the way it does when it recognizes a storm before the first drop. I whispered into the dark, not expecting an answer. What is he not telling me? The house didn't move. The night didn't breathe. But the question hung there, soft and certain, leading me into whatever waited next. The vegetables were sizzling quietly in the pan when I first heard it. Matthew's voice, low and strained, bleeding through the thin wall between the kitchen and the hallway. The overhead light flickered once, like it was listening with me. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. My hands simply froze over the cutting board when I heard him say Rowan's name. Not spoken. Whispered. Like a stone he couldn't set down without it hurting. I turned the flame lower so the room grew quieter, gentler, but his voice stayed sharp in that softened air. Every syllable sounded like it carried weight. Or guilt. Or both. When I stepped into the hallway, he flinched, not visibly but enough for me to feel the shift in the air. He hung up too fast and wiped his face with his palm before turning. And then he smiled. Too quickly. Too easily. A smile that didn't touch the eyes I'd known for 16 years. "Everything all right?" I asked, keeping my tone light, almost careless. He nodded, leaned in to kiss my cheek, and said we'd burn the onions. We hadn't. Dad was crying in the garage. The hallway felt colder after he walked away. Later that evening, the house settled into its nighttime hush, the kind that lets every secret breathe. I was folding Oliver's laundry when he appeared in the doorway, rubbing his arms, eyes too wide for bedtime. He stood there a moment, silent, like he was choosing which truth to let go of. "Mom," he whispered. "Dad was crying in the garage." My hand stilled around a shirt small enough to remind me how young he still was. I asked him softly if he was sure. He nodded, looking down at his socks, twisting them between his fingers the way he always did when something scared him. He kept saying a name, Oliver whispered. Rowan. Something inside me folded in on itself, a quiet, painful shift. I tried to steady my voice, to keep him from feeling the tremor settling beneath my ribs. "Did he see you?" I asked.
No.
He didn't turn on the light. The image came to me uninvited, Matthew alone in the dark, shoulders shaking, trying to hold together a version of himself he didn't want us to see. A man breaking where he thought no one would look. After I tucked Oliver into bed, I stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to the house breathe around me. Every creak of the old wooden floor felt like a memory resurfacing. Every shadow looked a little too still. The name Rowan hung in the darkness like a question neither of us wanted to speak aloud. I walked to the garage door, but my hand paused on the knob. The metal was cold, colder than it should have been for a mild evening. I didn't turn it. Instead, I pressed my palm flat against the door, imagining him on the other side, trying to swallow something he couldn't name out loud. It wasn't jealousy that tightened in my chest. It was the realization that I didn't know what kind of pain my husband had been carrying alone, or why he needed to hide its shape from me. Back in the kitchen, I sat at the table long after the dishes had dried. The quiet was thick enough to feel like fog settling low. I replayed the phone call, the urgency in his voice, the softness that wasn't meant for my ears. Rowan, a name that had once been nothing to us. Now it lived between us, heavy and uninvited. I wondered if Rowan was danger, or comfort, or a wound that had never truly healed. When Matthew finally came in from the garage, his footsteps were slow, deliberate. He didn't see me at first. He leaned against the counter and exhaled, long and shaky, like he'd been underwater too long. When he did notice me, he startled, straightened himself. "You're still up," he said. I nodded. My voice felt fragile when I spoke. "Rough night." He looked at me, then really looked, but only for a moment. Then he glanced away, jaw tightening just slightly. "It's nothing," he replied. The same nothing he had repeated too many times lately. He sat across from me, hands clasped as though bracing himself for a storm that hadn't yet arrived. The kitchen light hummed above us, a faint, trembling sound. I asked about Rowan gently, careful not to push too hard. He flinched just barely. "Claire," he said quietly, "please not tonight." It was the plea in his voice that caught me off guard. Not the words. The plea. Like he was asking for mercy he didn't deserve. I let the silence settle between us. Sometimes silence reveals more truth than questions. He reached for my hand, hesitated, then pulled back before touching me. That small retreat felt louder than anything he could have said, like he was afraid his truth would spill into me just by contact. Eventually, he stood and kissed the top of my head. A soft, practiced gesture. Then he whispered goodnight, but the word left his mouth like an apology. When he went upstairs, I stayed at the table, staring at the spot where his hands had been, at the empty air where honesty should have lived. Outside, a wind brushed against the windows, making the glass hum. Bare branches scraped against the siding in slow, deliberate strokes. It sounded like something trying to get in, or trying to get out. I found myself whispering the name, just once, letting it roll off my tongue like a question I wasn't ready to ask out loud. Rowan, a person Matthew feared, or missed, or owed something to. A person whose ghost was arriving long before he did. I didn't know what Rowan represented to my husband. Not yet. But I knew this much. Whatever shadow Rowan cast, it was already stretching its way into our home. And by Christmas, it would touch us all. The porch light flickered in the early winter dusk, casting a trembling gold across the falling snow. Rowan stood at the edge of the steps like she wasn't sure if she should come closer or turn back. Snow tangled in her hair, melting down her cheeks as slowly as tears. She didn't knock. She just waited, breathing into her cupped hands, her shoulders lifting slightly with every cold gust. Matthew opened the door first. Warm air spilled out, soft and welcoming, and for a moment it felt like it lifted her. She stepped into his arms, holding him too tightly, her fingers gripping the back of his coat as though she'd been holding herself together for too long. When she pulled away, her eyes slid past him and met mine. She offered a faint smile, but it didn't settle anywhere on her face. Inside, the house felt different with her in it. The heater hummed steadily. The old clock in the hallway ticked louder than usual. Oliver stood near the living room doorway, holding his toy motorcycle loosely by the handlebars. He watched Rowan with a strange mix of curiosity and worry, like he was trying to measure her presence against the cold she seemed to bring in with her. Matthew guided her inside, taking her coat from her shoulders. Snow slid off in small clumps, scattering onto the entryway rug. Rowan brushed her sleeves down, smoothing them carefully. That was when I saw them. Thin, pale lines along her wrists, disappearing under the frayed edges of her sleeves. She adjusted the fabric with quick fingers, a small motion, almost too natural. I offered her tea. She nodded softly, as though words required more steadiness than she had. She followed Matthew into the living room and sat on the couch, her hands wrapped around the cup before even tasting it. Steam rose into her face, making her eyes look glassy in the dim room. Oliver climbed up beside her, his knees tucked under him. "Did you walk here?" he asked in a small voice. Rowan held her breath for a moment, then exhaled. "Something like that," she murmured, her gaze drifting toward the window. She adjusted her sleeve again, though it hadn't moved. The room felt tight around her, like the air shifted to match the tension in her shoulders. Matthew tried to talk to her, gentle things, soft questions, but Rowan answered in fragments. Her mind was somewhere else. Each time a car passed outside, she flinched just enough for me to notice. The headlights brushed across the wall, and her eyes followed the movement, as though expecting it to stop at our door. A truck rolled slowly down the street, its tires grinding over frozen slush. Rowan stiffened, her breath catching. She leaned slightly toward the window, eyes narrowing. The truck passed without pausing, but she didn't relax. Not even after the sound faded down the block. I retreated to the kitchen, pretending to tidy the counter so I could watch her without being obvious. Rowan's fingers trembled faintly against the teacup. She kept glancing toward the window, each look carrying a little more urgency than the last. Oliver whispered near my side. "She's scared." His voice barely filled the space between us. But Rowan seemed to hear, or maybe she just sensed it. Her posture lowered, as if the truth of the observation pressed her down. When she finally spoke, it was sudden, fragile. "Have you seen anyone around?" Her words drifted toward Matthew. "Anyone unusual?" He looked at her carefully. "Why?" Rowan hesitated. She rubbed her thumb over the ceramic rim of the cup. "I thought I saw someone earlier. On the road." She kept her gaze fixed on the window. "I'm probably wrong. It's been a long day." "Someone you know?" I asked gently. She didn't answer. Her eyes stayed on the street, searching shadows that weren't there. For a moment, I thought she might cry, but she swallowed hard, setting the cup down with a tiny clink. "I'm fine," she whispered. "Really?" The tremor in her voice said otherwise. Matthew shifted closer, but she leaned away without noticing. Her knees bounced once, then stilled as she tucked her hands under her thighs. She kept her sleeves pulled low, as if the fabric alone could guard her. Later, after Oliver went upstairs, Rowan drifted toward the living room window again. Matthew stepped outside to bring in firewood, leaving us in the quiet glow of the lamp. She stood so close to the glass her breath fogged the surface, a soft cloud rising and fading with each exhale. Snow fell in slow sheets under the street lamp, turning the night pale and weightless. Rowan's reflection stared back at her, hollow-eyed, tired, younger than she seemed when she walked in. "I thought it was over," she murmured. Her fingers touched the pane lightly, tracing the outline of her reflection's face. "I really thought it was done." The house settled around us, wood creaking gently like an old memory shifting in its sleep. I didn't press her. The silence felt safer than words, and she seemed to need it. She stepped back from the window, her shoulders trembling beneath her sweater. She looked toward the door again, the same searching glance she'd given a dozen times already. Except this time, something in her face changed, a flicker of certainty, or fear, or something she had carried for too long. Snow kept falling. The porch light flickered again, and in the quiet between breaths, I felt a cold truth settle through the walls. Whatever Rowan had come here to escape was still somewhere out there in the dark. Dinner was almost quiet enough to hear the snow falling outside. The candles flickered against the window pane, throwing slow-moving shadows across Rowan's face. She sat at the far end of the table, her shoulders small beneath Matthew's old sweater, her fingers resting near her fork, but never lifting it. For a moment it felt peaceful. Too peaceful, like the kind of calm that comes before something shifts. Then she said a name. Just one word, barely above a whisper. "Hayes." The sound of it settled strangely in the room, heavy enough to bend the air. I felt my breath pause. Even the heater seemed to hum a little softer, as if listening. She blinked hard as soon as she said it, like she wished she could swallow the name back down. I asked gently, "Who's Hayes?" But she didn't answer. Not at first. She just twisted her napkin between her fingers, the fabric wrinkling under the tremor of her hands. "No one," she murmured. "It doesn't matter." But Matthew reacted before I could speak again. His grip tightened around his fork, knuckles whitening, jaw shifting in a way I'd only seen during nights when old memories found him in his sleep. He didn't look at Rowan.
He didn't look at me.
He just stared at the table, breathing carefully through his nose as though steadying himself against something unseen. Rowan noticed. Her eyes darted toward him, soft with something like apology, but she looked away just as quickly. The table fell into a silence that felt too sharp to touch. Oliver watched all of this with quiet intensity. He wasn't eating. His spoon hovered over his plate, forgotten. He leaned slightly toward Rowan, studying her the way children study animals they aren't sure are friendly or hurt. "You look tired," he said softly. "Like you haven't slept in a long time." Rowan's lips parted, but no words came out. She pushed her chair back instead. The legs scraped gently against the wooden floor. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I need a moment." She stood so fast the candlelight flickered from her shadow. She wrapped her arms around herself and walked down the hallway, shoulders trembling with each step. She didn't look back. The guest room door closed with a soft click. For a moment, none of us moved. The space she left behind felt colder, as though her fear was still lingering at the table with us. Oliver picked at a piece of bread, eyes still on the hallway. "She's scared," he said. "It looks like it hurts her to blink." I smoothed his hair gently. His small observations always cut straight to the truth. "She's had a hard time," I whispered. Matthew wasn't touching his food anymore. His fork lay on the plate, abandoned. He pressed his hands together, palms slowly rubbing as if warming them against an invisible chill. "She shouldn't have said that name," he muttered, voice strained. I watched him carefully. "You know him," I said. He stood abruptly and carried his plate to the sink. The running water sounded too loud, too fast, like he was using the noise as a barrier. He didn't respond until the stream quieted into silence. I hoped I'd never hear it again. His shoulders sagged slightly, the first crack in whatever wall he was trying to keep upright. "What does he have to do with Rowan?" I asked. Matthew dried his hands slowly. He didn't turn around. "Someone she should have stayed far, far away from." His voice was low enough that it barely reached me. Oliver's hand slipped into mine again. His voice was a whisper. "Is she in danger?" I didn't answer him. Not because I didn't want to, but because the truth had begun to form inside me, cold and steady. Rowan wasn't visiting for warmth or memories. She wasn't here because of some simple holiday loneliness. She was hiding. And the name she said, Hayes, wasn't just a slip. It was fear breaking through her calm. It was the sound of something catching up to her. I began clearing the table slowly, stacking plates so the movements felt gentle, unthreatening. The house had grown quieter. The kind of quiet that feels like the pause before you hear footsteps outside your door. Matthew stood near the sink, staring at nothing, lost somewhere inside thoughts he didn't want to share. I walked toward the hallway, drawn by the faint, uneven rhythm of Rowan's breathing behind the guest room door. She wasn't crying. It wasn't loud enough for that. It was the sound of someone trying not to fall apart. Someone trying to hold the pieces of themselves in place with shaking hands. I hovered near the door, not knocking, just letting her presence settle against mine through the thin wood. The lamp in the hallway cast a warm glow, but the air still felt chilled, like a draft slipping through a window someone forgot to lock. Behind me, Matthew stepped into the hallway, rubbing the back of his neck. "She's been running for a long time," he said quietly. "From Hayes?" I asked. He didn't answer, but the silence was loud enough. Oliver padded toward us, stopping near the bottom of the stairs. "She's scared of someone," he whispered. I saw it in her eyes. I nodded. "I think you're right." Snow continued falling outside, heavier now, pressing its quiet against the house. The porch light glowed dimly through the frosted window, flickering as though unsure how to hold steady. Rowan's breathing softened behind the door, still trembling, still uneven. Something about it made my own breath slow, matching her rhythm like an unspoken offering. In that moment, the truth settled fully. She wasn't just passing through. She wasn't visiting old friends. She was hiding from someone who had left marks on her, scars on her wrists, shadows in her gaze, fear in the tremble of her voice. She was hiding from a man named Hayes. And the worst part wasn't that she had spoken his name. It was that the moment she did, Matthew looked like he already knew exactly what kind of danger it carried. The house was quiet in that way winter nights often are, when the wind settles low, and the walls seem to breathe a little slower. I moved down the hallway with an extra blanket draped over my arm, thinking of the way Rowan had wrapped her own arms around herself earlier, as though she were holding something inside that might spill out if she loosened her grip. The guest room door was cracked open, a thin line of darkness waiting behind it. I pushed it gently, letting the hallway light spill across the neatly made bed. The dresser sat beneath the window, its paint slightly chipped along the handles. The blankets were kept in the top drawer. I opened it, expecting soft fabric, and nothing more. But something shifted beneath Rowan's folded sweater, a small corner of glossy paper, tucked away where it wasn't meant to be found. I lifted the blanket slowly, revealing the photograph beneath it. My breath caught before I even fully saw the image. It felt wrong in my hand, warm from the blankets, like it had been hidden with purpose. I slid it free and held it under the light. The edges were worn, a little bent, like it had been carried often. When the picture came into focus, my heart gave a slow, startled thud. Rowan stood in it, younger, her hair tied back, her smile thin but steady. Beside her was Matthew, but not the Matthew I knew. This version of him was thinner, his face hollowed in ways time alone couldn't explain. Fear sat in his eyes, the kind that isn't loud but lives quietly beneath the skin. Before I could process that, another small detail pulled me deeper. Oliver was in the photograph too. 8 years old, maybe younger, his hand wrapped gently around Rowan's. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at her, as if seeking reassurance from a stranger he somehow trusted more than the moment itself. My first instinct was denial. Maybe it was from years before Matthew and I met. But Oliver would have been a toddler back then, barely walking. And Rowan hadn't been part of our lives yet. Not that I knew of. Not that I'd ever been told. I lowered myself onto the edge of the bed, the floor creaking softly under my weight like it recognized the shift inside me. The photograph trembled slightly in my hands, and I wasn't sure if it was the cold in the room or the realization blooming in my chest. Why had Rowan been with Matthew? Why had she been with Oliver? And why did Matthew look like a man who'd been cornered by something he didn't know how to escape? A soft thud echoed through the house, the kind of small sound that makes you forget to breathe for a second. I listened. Nothing followed. The heater clicked on, filling the silence with a gentle hum. I looked back down at the photograph, tracing Oliver's face with my thumb. He looked so small, so trusting, and so unaware of whatever darkness was unfolding around him. This picture hadn't been taken during our engagement. It couldn't have been. The timelines didn't fit, not by miles. This wasn't a memory I'd missed. It was a memory I'd never been allowed to know. I flipped the photograph over. No date. No writing. Just a faint smudge along the back, where someone had once held it too tightly. Maybe Rowan. Maybe Matthew. Maybe both. A rustle drifted from the hallway, Rowan shifting in her bed, or maybe simply turning over with the weight of whatever past she carried. I found myself staring at her folded sweater in the drawer. It smelled faintly of pine and old air, as if she'd traveled far and alone. She'd tucked this photograph under her things, shielded and hidden. Not forgotten. Protected. I placed the picture on my lap and looked around the room. The shadows stretched differently now, long fingers reaching across the floor like the truth had rearranged the space itself. I stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtains slightly aside. Snow was falling again, thick and slow, covering the dark street in a soft, quiet veil. The photograph felt heavier than paper when I held it again. I imagined Matthew standing beside Rowan all those years ago, thinner, frightened, looking at a camera like it might capture more than just light, like it might capture the secrets he couldn't say aloud. And Oliver, small and clinging to Rowan's hand, trusting her without even knowing why. A cold understanding settled inside me. Rowan wasn't just connected to Matthew. She was connected to Oliver. And, whatever bond they once had, Matthew had chosen to let it fade into silence. My fingers tightened around the photo's edges. 1,000 questions rose in me, each one louder than the last. But one echoed above them all, steady and undeniable. Why had Rowan been in my son's life before I ever knew she existed? I slipped the photograph back beneath the sweaters exactly where I found it. The drawer closed with a soft thump, sealing the secret inside again. But nothing in me closed with it. The truth had already begun to unspool, quiet but unstoppable. As I stepped into the hallway, I glanced toward Rowan's door. A faint strip of light glowed at the bottom, her shadow moving gently behind it. She wasn't sleeping. Neither was I. The house held its breath with us listening, waiting. And in the stillness, one thought pressed against me like a cold hand at my back. Rowan hadn't come here by chance. She had come because of a past I was never meant to see. The house felt too still when I walked back into the living room, like the air had stopped moving. Matthew stood near the window, his hand pressed against the cold glass. Snow drifted outside in soft spirals, but his shoulders stayed rigid, as if bracing against something only he could see. He didn't turn when I stepped closer. I could see his reflection in the pane, tired eyes, a jaw clenched tight, the faint tremble of someone holding himself together by habit, not strength. "Matthew," I said quietly, "I found a photograph." He closed his eyes for a moment. That was all it took for everything to shift. He sank onto the couch, as though his legs could no longer hold him. I sat across from him, my hands folded in my lap, waiting for him to speak. The lamplight caught the edges of his face, softening the lines that had deepened over the years. I didn't push. I just waited. Sometimes silence is the only key that fits. "She lived with me," he finally whispered. His fingers rubbed together slowly, as if remembering the feel of something long gone. "It was only for a short time. After we separated. Before everything settled again." His words felt fragile, like stepping on ice you're not sure is frozen solid. I swallowed. "You never told me." I leaned closer, fingertips brushing the cold glass. The porch light shimmered a dim circle onto the yard, just enough to see what didn't belong. Footprints. A trail of them. Not ours. Not new, but not old either. They led across the yard, curving toward the side of the house, disappearing into the shadow beneath Rowan's window. My throat tightened. The glass fogged under my breath. I walked down the hallway with slow, deliberate steps, each one quieter than the last. The floor creaked once, like it wanted to warn me. I opened Rowan's door. She sat upright in the dim glow of her lamp, knees pulled to her chest, as if she'd been awake long before I arrived. Her eyes lifted to mine. "He's here," she whispered, voice thin and cracking. "I know it." I sat beside her on the bed, heart pounding against my ribs. "Rowan, there are footprints outside." Her breath hitched. She shook her head hard, hands gripping the blanket. "No. No, please. He found me." Her whole body trembled. "I knew it. I knew it the second we got close to this place. He always finds me." The panic in her voice rose like a tide, quiet but powerful. I touched her arm gently. "We'll wake Matthew. We'll figure this out." She pulled away fast, not from me, but from the idea. "No. You can't tell him. You can't tell anyone." Her eyes widened with a fear so pure it made my skin prickle. "Don't call the police. Don't let him call them." Matthew appeared in the doorway, breath uneven, hair tousled like he'd run straight from a dream. "Claire? What's going?" He saw Rowan curled in on herself and stepped further inside. "What happened?" I pointed toward the window. "Someone's outside." Matthew stiffened. His jaw set in a hard, old way, the kind that comes back when memory takes over. "I'm calling the police." Rowan lunged forward, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength. "No. You can't. If you call them, he'll take Oliver." The words cracked through the room like a sudden break in ice. Matthew froze. I felt the air leave my lungs in a sharp, cold rush. What do you mean, take Oliver? I asked, but the question sounded small, almost swallowed by the dark. Rowan's breathing turned shallow. She shook her head in frantic, broken motions. He knows. He knows your boy. He knows Matthew cared for me. And he knows I stayed here once with both of you. He watches. He waits for moments like this. My skin chilled. How does he even know Oliver exists? Rowan squeezed her eyes shut, as if the memory itself could burn her. Because I told him once. Before I understood what he really was. Before I ran. She looked at me then, really looked, with a hollow ache in her eyes. I didn't mean for him to know. I never thought he'd use it. Matthew sat on the edge of the bed, face pale. Rowan, what exactly did you tell him? Her voice broke into pieces. That you had a son. That he was small. That he trusted me. Her breath stuttered. Hayes remembers everything. And when I left, he kept the pieces he knew could hurt. The room seemed to tilt. My hands went numb. I tried to form words, but nothing rose past my throat. Rowan covered her mouth, as if holding back a sob she didn't want either of us to hear. He said, she whispered through trembling fingers, that if I ever went to the police, he'd take the child closest to me. Oliver. A cold wind pressed suddenly against the window, rattling it in the frame. Rowan flinched as though struck. I felt something deep in my chest tighten, a knot pulling itself taut around my heart. Matthew stood abruptly and checked the hallway, then the front door, then every lock in the house. His footsteps moved urgently but quietly, a deep instinctual fear rising in him that I'd only seen once before, the night he woke from a nightmare he refused to explain. I remained beside Rowan. Her shoulders shook beneath my hand, but she kept her gaze fixed on the door, as though expecting it to open at any moment. Claire, she whispered, I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to touch you. Or him. I swallowed the tightness rising in my throat. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell us sooner? She stared at her hands. Because you're the one good thing he never touched. And I wanted to keep it that way. Matthew returned, closing the door behind him softly. Oliver is asleep, he murmured, though his voice was strained. I'll stay in his room tonight. No, Rowan said, voice ragged. You don't understand. Staying awake won't stop him if he wants something. Matthew's jaw hardened. He is not taking my son. Her breathing quickened. That's why you can't call the police. If they show up, he'll know I ran to you again. He'll know exactly where to aim. My gaze drifted back to the window. The footprints outside glowed faintly in the moonlit snow, a trail leading straight to us. Straight to her. Straight to our family. Claire, Rowan said gently, I'll leave if I have to. If it keeps you safe. If it keeps Oliver safe. I looked at her then, really looked. The exhaustion. The fear. The weight she'd been carrying alone for years. And I realized something I hadn't let myself believe until now. Her past didn't just brush against our lives. It was woven into them. Tighter and deeper than I ever knew. The wind howled once, long and low, as though warning us of what lay beyond the glass. And in that moment, I understood the truth settling cold in my chest. Hayes wasn't a memory returning. He was already here. I woke before the sun, the kind of waking that comes from something more than restlessness. The air felt wrong. Still. My feet touched the cold floor, and that's when I saw it, a small slip of paper folded in half, pushed beneath our bedroom door. The edges were creased, as if handled by someone with trembling fingers. I knelt slowly, the boards groaning under my weight like they were protesting the truth I was about to pick up. The note was light in my hand. Too light for the heaviness it carried. I opened it. You can't protect him. My breath caught. The room tilted slightly. The words were small, uneven, like they'd been written in a hurry, or by someone smiling while they wrote. I walked down the hallway with the note clenched in my hand, my heartbeat echoing in my throat. Matthew was in the kitchen, staring out the window at the pale morning light. When I held a paper out to him, he didn't speak. His eyes moved across the words once. Then again. The color drained from his face. Where did you find this? His voice was barely audible. Under the door, I whispered. While we were sleeping. He closed his eyes for a long moment, one hand braced against the counter. The other hung limp at his side, still clutching the note. I'd never seen him look so defeated, not even in the hard years, not even when life had cracked open beneath us. This was different. This was a man recognizing a threat he'd once escaped and prayed never to meet again. A soft sound came from behind us, a small gasp, then a thud. Rowan stood near the entrance to the hallway, her hand pressed to her chest. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, as though she were seeing something much farther away than the paper in Matthew's hand. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." Her knees buckled before Matthew could reach her. She dropped to the floor, legs folding beneath her, palms flat on the wood as if trying to hold herself to the earth. "He's close. He's so close." Matthew knelt beside her. "Rowan." She shook her head violently. "He got inside. He got inside the house. He was here. While we slept." She pulled her hands to her face, fingers digging into her temples. I told you, he always finds a way." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that there had to be another explanation, but the truth sat cold in my stomach. Someone had stood outside our bedroom door. Someone had been close enough to touch us. Close enough to take Oliver without a sound. Oliver. I hurried down the hall, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Oliver." I called softly before opening his door. He was sitting up in bed, hair messy, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The sight of him, small, warm, safe, nearly brought me to my knees. I walked to him, brushing the hair from his forehead. "Honey, we need to talk for a moment." He looked up at me with those soft eyes that never learned to expect danger. "Mom? Why are you shaking?" I sat beside him, pulling the blanket gently over his lap. "Someone left a note," I said carefully. "A mean one. But we're here. You're safe." He studied me with a seriousness far beyond his age. Why would someone want to take me? The question slipped out like he'd been carrying it longer than I realized, like he'd heard things meant for adult ears. Something in my chest cracked. Outside his window, snow had begun to fall in silent flakes, each one drifting slowly toward the ground. The world looked peaceful, but inside the house, the air felt tight, trembling, like we were living in the paused breath of something unknown. I wrapped my arm around him. "No one is taking you," I whispered, though the promise felt too thin for the weight it needed to hold. His small fingers curled around mine. "Is it the man Rowan is scared of?" I froze. "What makes you think that?" "I heard her crying last night," he said softly. She kept saying his name under her breath. Hayes. Like she was saying sorry to someone who wasn't even here. The room felt smaller. The air colder. I led him back to the kitchen where Rowan sat pressed against the wall, her legs pulled in, her breath unsteady. Matthew stood above her, one hand on her shoulder, though his eyes were fixed on the note like it was a live thing that might bite him. Oliver stepped closer, looking from one adult to the next. "Please just tell me the truth," he said. "Why does he want me?" Rowan's face collapsed. She reached for him instinctively, then stopped herself, as though she no longer believed she had the right. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know he would ever use you." Matthew closed his eyes, jaw clenched. "Rowan, he wanted leverage," she said, voice shaking. "He wanted something to hold over me. Something to hold over you." Her gaze moved to Oliver slowly, painfully. "You were the easiest piece." I felt sick. "What do you mean?" Rowan looked at me then, and it wasn't just fear in her eyes, it was guilt carved deep into the bone. Hayes knew Matthew had someone he cared about. Someone small. Someone he could threaten without lifting a hand. Oliver stepped back, leaning against my side. I tightened my arm around him. Matthew rubbed his forehead with the heel of his palm. "He didn't know your name. He didn't know Claire yet. Just that. I had a son. That was enough." The realization slid through me like ice. Rowan had seen Oliver before I ever met her. Hayes had known my child existed long before I even knew Rowan's face. And Matthew had held this dark knot of past and fear so tightly it had grown roots beneath our lives. The house seemed to draw in around us, the walls shrinking, the light dimming. Even the heater's hum felt afraid. Oliver whispered, "What secret is he talking about? What does he want with me?" Rowan closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Because you were the one thing Matthew had that haze could break." Outside, the wind shifted, brushing against the house like a warning. And for the first time I understood. Our lives weren't being haunted by Rowan's past. We were living inside it. The sound reached me first, a low, steady rumble that didn't belong to the quiet of our street. I was standing at the sink, rinsing a cup, when I felt the vibration through the floorboards. A car engine. Not passing. Not struggling in the cold. Just waiting. Rowan appeared in the hallway like a startled animal, eyes wide, hands trembling. "Is someone here?" she whispered. Before I could answer, she rushed past me and slipped into the bathroom. The door clicked shut, followed by the soft scrape of the lock. I could hear her breathing on the other side, uneven, broken, like she was trying to swallow her own heartbeat. The engine outside kept humming. A patient sound, a knowing sound. I stepped to the window slowly, palms damp against the curtain. The snow had thickened along the ground, glowing faintly under the porch light. And there, by the line of pines across the yard, a figure stood half-shadowed, half-illumined. Still. Facing the house. A shape with shoulders too square, posture too calm. Watching. My breath clouded the glass. Footsteps came behind me. Matthew stopped at my shoulder, looking past me to the darkness outside. His jaw tightened. I saw something shift in him, something old, something I'd never been allowed to see. Without a word, he grabbed his coat from the hook by the door. "Matthew," I whispered, "don't." He didn't answer. He opened the back door, slipping out silently into the cold, disappearing around the house toward the trees. The snow swallowed his footsteps within seconds. The bathroom door creaked open behind me. Rowan stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame. "Did he go out there?" I nodded. Her knees buckled. She caught herself on the wall. "He can't face him alone," she murmured. "Not him. Not Hayes." The name iced the air between us. Minutes passed. Long ones. Rowan paced the hall in small, frantic circles, fingers tugging at the ends of her sleeves until the fabric curled. I hovered between the window and the sound of her breathing, waiting for something, a shout, a shape moving, any sign of what was happening beyond the quiet glass. The engine cut off. Silence fell so thick it felt physical. Rowan froze mid-step. I could hear only the wind shifting ghost-like through the trees. Then, finally, the back door creaked open. Matthew stepped inside, snow clinging to his coat, his hair damp with frost. He stood there, shoulders slumped, as though the cold had hollowed him out. His eyes. I had never seen eyes like that on him. Not fear. Not anger. Surrender. Rowan pressed her hands to her mouth. "What did he say?" Matthew didn't look at her. Or at me. He stared at the floor, at the melting snow dripping from his coat. "He wants you back," he murmured. "He says you know too much to be out in the world without him." Rowan's breath left her in a soft, strangled sound. Matthew swallowed. "And he wants leverage." I felt myself step forward, though I didn't remember moving. "What does that mean?" He finally lifted his eyes to mine. Pain lived there. Old and deep and defeated. "Hayes wants Oliver." The world stopped. Rowan collapsed onto the couch, hands shaking so violently she could barely hold them still. "I told you," she whispered. "He uses what people love. He always uses it." I shook my head. But why Oliver? What could he possibly think? Matthew cut me off with a breath that broke in the middle. He rubbed his forehead with the heel of his palm, dragging it down his face slowly. "He thinks Oliver belongs to him." My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" "He thinks Oliver is his," Matthew said softly, voice cracking. "He thinks he's Oliver's father." The room tilted. My knees weakened, and I gripped the edge of the table just to stay standing. "That's not possible. That's not." He convinced himself of it years ago, Matthew said. When Rowan was living with me. When things were different. He looked toward the pines, toward the place Hayes had stood. He told himself that Rowan ran because of the child. That she took something that belonged to him. Rowan shook her head violently.
No.
He created the story because it gave him power. He didn't even care what was true. He cared that Matthew believed he might do something terrible if he didn't obey. I stared at them both. And you never thought to tell me this? Matthew's mouth opened, then closed. He sank into a chair like all the strength had left him. I didn't want it to touch our life, he whispered. I wanted him sealed in the past. Buried. But the past was outside in the snow. And it had left footprints at our door. A soft sound came from the hallway. Oliver stood there in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes, barefoot against the cold floor. Mom, he whispered. Why is everyone scared? Rowan covered her face. Matthew looked away. I went to him, kneeling so my eyes were level with his. My hands rested on his shoulders, trying to anchor myself as much as him. We're okay, I whispered, though my voice trembled. We're right here. He looked past me, gaze catching the snow melting from Matthew's coat. Is the bad man here? Something inside me cracked open. No one is taking you, I whispered fiercely. No one. But behind me, Rowan let out a sound too soft to be a sob, too broken to be a breath.
He won't stop, she said.
He never stops. The house felt smaller, the air colder. Fear threaded through the walls like frost spreading against glass. Matthew finally lifted the note from the counter, the one we'd found beneath our bedroom door. You can't protect him. His fingers tightened around it, crumpling the paper. For the first time, I realized Hayes wasn't trying to scare us. He was warning us, claiming something that had never been his.
Something he intended to take.
And the question I'd been too afraid to ask wrapped itself around my heart like a cold hand. What secret bound Rowan, Matthew, and Hayes to my son, and how much of Oliver's life had been shaped by a past I never knew existed? Rowan sat curled on the edge of the couch, hands trembling in her lap, breath coming in shallow bursts. The house felt too quiet around us, like the walls were leaning in to hear the truth she'd been running from. Snow tapped softly against the windows. Oliver slept upstairs, unaware of the storm gathering under his roof. Matthew stood a few feet away, pale, still dusted with flakes from the pine grove. He didn't look at either of us. He kept his eyes fixed on a spot on the floor, as if the truth were written there and he could read it without having to say it out loud. I knelt beside Rowan. Tell me, I whispered. Whatever it is, just tell me. Her fingers tightened around the blanket until her knuckles blanched. He thinks Oliver is his, she choked out. Hayes believes Oliver is his son. The room shifted beneath me. It felt like the air thinned. I turned slowly toward Matthew. What is she talking about? Matthew flinched at the sound of my voice. Then he exhaled, a long, defeated breath that seemed to drain years out of him. He finally lifted his eyes, and when they met mine, they were full of a pain I didn't have a name for. It was my fault, he said softly. All of it. The whole mess. I lied. My pulse hammered in my ears. Lied about what? He sat down heavily, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together like he needed to hold himself in place. When Hayes came after Rowan when he wouldn't let her go, Matthew swallowed hard. He needed to believe she'd moved on, that she had a new life, a new family. Something that didn't include him. Rowan wiped her face, shoulders shaking. He wanted a claim. He always needed something to hold over me. A reason to keep me. Matthew continued, voice cracking. I told him she had a child. A little boy. I told him Oliver was hers. Not yours. Not mine. His gaze lowered. Hers. The words hit like a sudden shift in gravity. The memory of that old photograph flickered in my mind. Oliver at 8, Rowan holding his hand, Matthew looking like a man on the edge of something crushing. I felt the floor sway. You told him Oliver was Rowan's son. My voice barely held. Matthew nodded, shame pulling his shoulders inward. I thought it would make Hayes leave her alone. I thought if he believed she'd start it over, he'd let go. He doesn't let go, Rowan whispered into her hands. He only reaches farther. A sickening quiet settled over the room. I stood up slowly, pressing a hand to my temple as if I could steady the room that way. So Hayes spent years believing Oliver belonged to Rowan. And if Rowan was his, then the boy would be his too, Matthew finished faintly. A cold wave rolled through my body, numbing my fingertips. Matthew, you didn't cheat on me. You didn't betray me that way. My voice wavered. You lied to protect her. He looked up, startled by the clarity in my words, but there was no relief there. Only regret. I thought the lie would die with the moment, he whispered. I never imagined it would follow us here. To him. Rowan let out a broken sound. Half cry, half gasp. He'll take anyone he thinks he owns, she sobbed. Anyone tied to him in his mind. He doesn't need truth. He only needs belief. I turned toward her, heart aching. Rowan, why didn't you tell me earlier? Why let me keep living blind? Her eyes filled again, tears rolling fast. Because I didn't want to poison your family. I didn't want my past touching Oliver. Or you. Or anything you built. She lifted trembling hands. But the lie wasn't mine. I never wanted your son involved. I stared at Matthew. You told Hayes a story to save her, and you tied our child to a man he's never met. Matthew's breath shattered. I didn't know what else to do. He had a gun. He had Rowan pinned against the wall. I said the first thing I could think of. The thing I thought would make him stop. His eyes glassed with tears he refused to let fall. I thought I could rewrite the truth later. But he remembered the lie. He wrote Oliver into a story that never belonged to him. I sank into the chair across from them, my hands trembling in my lap. The room felt smaller. The ceiling lower. Even the air felt colder, as if Hayes himself were breathing just outside the window. Upstairs, a soft creak sounded, Oliver turning in his sleep, unaware that the darkness outside had pinned him into a stranger's delusion. Rowan whispered into the quiet, he won't stop until he takes back what he thinks is his. Silence wrapped around us, thick and heavy. What do we do now? I finally whispered. Matthew didn't answer. Rowan didn't either. Because the truth had already filled the room like frost on a window. A lie meant to save one life had placed another in danger. And Hayes was coming to collect a child who the morning felt strangely bright for all the darkness we had lived through. The air outside shimmered with the faintest promise of warmth, though winter still clung stubbornly to the trees. When the police car pulled into the driveway, its tires crunching over the frozen ground, Rowan stood between Matthew and me, her hands shaking so visibly she tucked them into her sleeves to hide the tremor. Hayes was already on the porch, surrounded by officers who had approached quietly from both sides of the house. He didn't struggle. He didn't shout. He simply looked at Rowan with the same cold, flat stare that had haunted her for years, a stare that had once convinced Matthew to lie and Rowan to run, and all of us to believe safety was something fragile enough to slip through fingers. But as two officers placed cuffs around his wrists, he finally broke eye contact. Rowan flinched like the world had snapped, but she didn't look away. Not this time. Her voice wavered as she gave her statement. She didn't speak loudly. She didn't look at Hayes. She simply told the truth, what he had done, what he had threatened, what he believed he owned. Her words drifted up into the cold air like pieces of breath she'd been holding for years. And the moment she finished, something inside her seemed to loosen, like a rope finally dropping from her shoulders. When the car door closed behind Hayes, Rowan let out a low, shaky exhale.
She didn't weep.
She didn't collapse. She just stood there, snow glittering in her hair, the wind lifting the ends of her coat like it wanted to carry her somewhere new. Matthew stepped closer to me. His hands were clasped in front of him, white at the knuckles. I'm sorry, he whispered. Not for helping her. Not for caring. But for fearing the truth enough to hide it from you. The apology sat between us like something delicate, something that had needed daylight to survive. I stared at him for a long moment, feeling the ache of the last few days settle into something softer. I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't know how to, but because the silence felt cleaner than any words I could have offered. Oliver stood beside me, bundled in his coat, watching the police car disappear down the street. When he slipped his hand into mine, the simple weight of it grounded me in a way nothing else had. His fingers were warm despite the cold. He didn't ask if Hayes was gone for good. He didn't ask if everything was safe now. He just held my hand like the world made sense again. Inside, we gathered around the living room. The house had been scrubbed of fear somehow, not because danger had vanished, but because truth had finally taken its place. Rowan sat on the couch, her breathing steady but her eyes still distant, as though she were testing the world's edges to make sure they were stable. Matthew brought her a cup of tea. She took it with both hands, whispering a quiet thank you. For the rest of Christmas week, the house held a gentle warmth. Rowan laughed once at something Oliver said, a tiny sound, but so unexpected that Matthew and I both froze just to hear it again. She helped him build a puzzle by the fireplace, her trembling hands growing steadier each day. When the holiday passed and the thaw began, Rowan stood by the window with her bag packed. A thin layer of melting snow glittered across the porch. She looked stronger, not healed, not untouched, but ready to step into a life she'd been denied for far too long. "All right," she told Oliver, giving him a soft smile. "And when I'm settled, maybe you and your mom can visit." Oliver nodded seriously, as though accepting a mission. Rowan laughed under her breath, then turned to Matthew. Their embrace was long, quiet, threaded with years of guilt and survival and gratitude. When she finally pulled away, she looked at me with eyes that weren't haunted anymore, just tired and strangely hopeful.
"Thank you," she said.
"For seeing me, for letting me stay, for believing the truth when I was too afraid to speak it." I hugged her gently. "Go build something good," I whispered. "You deserve it." She nodded, wiped her eyes, and stepped out into the thawing morning. The world outside felt brighter, as if the sun had finally found its way through clouds that had clung too tightly. I watched her walk down the path, snow melting beneath her feet. For the first time, she wasn't running. She was leaving. Matthew came to stand beside me. Oliver played quietly behind us, humming to himself as he pushed toy cars across the rug. The house seemed to stretch, breathe, almost settle. But as I looked out at the porch, at the thin sheen of melting ice, the pines standing silent, the path Hayes had once stood on, a question pressed gently, insistently against my ribs. What other secrets had fear taught the people I loved to bury? The snow melted drop by drop, but the echoes of hidden truths lingered like footprints beneath the surface, waiting for the warmth to reveal them. Had never once belonged to him. The next morning came with a pale sunlight that felt too gentle for everything we had survived. The house smelled of coffee and the faint sweetness of the cinnamon rolls I had started before realizing my hands were shaking too much to finish icing them. Oliver sat at the table coloring quietly, humming under his breath. Every now and then he'd glance toward Rowan, who sat by the window as though afraid to move too far from the sunlight. Matthew cleaned the kitchen, though there wasn't much to clean. He needed the motion, something to do with his hands, something to quiet the guilt coiled inside his chest. I watched them all from the threshold, a strange little portrait of survival. A family not broken, but bent in places we didn't know how to straighten just yet. Rowan looked out the window with a distant gaze. "It's strange," she murmured. "I spent years terrified he would come for me. And now that he can't, I don't know who I am without the fear." "You're someone new," I said gently. "Someone rebuilding." She gave a small, unsure laugh. "Rebuilding feels heavy. It always does." Matthew turned from the sink. "You don't have to do it alone anymore." For a moment, Rowan's eyes softened toward him in a way that reminded me of something old. Not love, but gratitude that had been waiting for years to speak. "I know," she whispered, "but I don't want to weigh your family down anymore." "You haven't," I said. She looked at me, really looked, as though searching for anger or resentment that wasn't there. Maybe it had existed once, a flicker of jealousy, a crack of fear. But now it was something else, understanding, complicated and quiet, but real. "You're kinder than I deserve," she said. No one deserves fear, I replied. Oliver stood abruptly and walked over to her. Will you still stay for Christmas? He asked earnestly. We haven't done the gingerbread house yet. Rowan smiled, small and tender. I'll stay. His face lit up, and the simple joy of it filled the room like a warm lamp in winter. Later that day, we decorated cookies, though most of the icing ended up on Oliver's face. Rowan laughed, a sound fragile but genuine, and Matthew watched her with a complicated expression I could finally understand. Not romantic longing, not regret, recognition of who she'd been, of who he'd been, of the darkness they once survived together. That night, as I tucked Oliver into bed, he whispered, Mom, is she going to be okay now? I brushed his hair back from his forehead. I think she will. He nodded thoughtfully. Good. I like her. When I stepped out of his room, I paused. The hallway light glowed warmly across the floor. Rowan and Matthew sat by the fireplace downstairs, speaking in low voices. They weren't hiding. They weren't whispering secrets meant to be buried. It was the sound of closure, something rare and tender. For the first time in weeks, my chest loosened. The house felt lighter, no longer shadowed by footsteps or threats or lies meant to protect, but ending in pain. That night, I slept through until morning. The next morning came with a pale sunlight that felt too gentle for everything we had survived. The house smelled of coffee and the faint sweetness of the cinnamon rolls I had started before realizing my hands were shaking too much to finish icing them. Oliver sat at the table coloring quietly, humming under his breath. Every now and then he glanced toward Rowan, who sat by the window as though afraid to move too far from the sunlight. Matthew cleaned the kitchen, though there wasn't much to clean. He needed the motion, something to do with his hands, something to quiet the guilt coiled inside his chest. I watched them all from the threshold, a strange little portrait of survival. A family not broken, but bent in places we didn't know how to straighten just yet. Rowan looked out the window with a distant gaze. It's strange, she murmured. I spent years terrified he would come for me. And now that he can't, I don't know who I am without the fear. You're someone new, I said gently. Someone rebuilding. She gave a small, unsure laugh. Rebuilding feels heavy. It always does. Matthew turned from the sink. You don't have to do it alone anymore. For a moment, Rowan's eyes softened toward him in a way that reminded me of something old. Not love, but gratitude that had been waiting for years to speak. I know, she whispered, but I don't want to weigh your family down anymore. You haven't, I said. She looked at me, really looked, as though searching for anger or resentment that wasn't there. Maybe it had existed once, a flicker of jealousy, a crack of fear. But now it was something else. Understanding, complicated and quiet, but real. You're kinder than I deserve, she said. No one deserves fear, I replied. Oliver stood abruptly and walked over to her. Will you still stay for Christmas? He asked earnestly. We haven't done the gingerbread house yet. Rowan smiled, small and tender. I'll stay. His face lit up, and the simple joy of it filled the room like a warm lamp in winter. Later that day, we decorated cookies, though most of the icing ended up on Oliver's face. Rowan laughed, a sound fragile but genuine, and Matthew watched her with a complicated expression I could finally understand. Not romantic longing, not regret, recognition of who she'd been, of who he'd been, of the darkness they once survived together. That night, as I tucked Oliver into bed, he whispered, Mom, is she going to be okay now? I brushed his hair back from his forehead. I think she will. He nodded thoughtfully.
Good.
I like her. When I stepped out of his room, I paused. The hallway light glowed warmly across the floor. Rowan and Matthew sat by the fireplace downstairs, speaking in low voices. They weren't hiding. They weren't whispering secrets meant to be buried. It was the sound of closure, something rare and tender. For the first time in weeks, my chest loosened. The house felt lighter, no longer shadowed by footsteps or threats or lies meant to protect, but ending in pain. That night, I slept through until morning. The first time in a long time. Rowan left 3 days after Christmas, her suitcase tucked against her leg, her scarf wrapped gently around her neck. The snow had begun to thaw, dripping from the gutters like a house sighing in relief. Matthew hugged her on the porch. Not tightly, not desperately, just long enough to say everything words couldn't. When he stepped back, his eyes were softer than I'd seen all month. "Be good to yourself," he murmured. She nodded, wiping her cheek. "You too." Then she hugged Oliver, who clung to her for a full minute before letting go. "Promise you'll write?" he asked. Rowan knelt, cupping his face in her hands. "I promise." When she stood to face me, her eyes shone, not with tears, but with something like beginning.
"Thank you," she said.
"For opening your home to someone who didn't know how to be a person anymore." "You're learning again," I said. "Maybe," she whispered. "Because of you." I hugged her gently. She felt lighter than she had when she arrived, like the storm had finally broken open and left something softer behind. She walked down the path, boots crunching in the slush. At the street, she turned back and lifted her hand. Not goodbye, something quieter. Something like hope. I stood on the porch long after her car disappeared from view. The wind brushed past me, carrying the scent of thawing pine and distant roads. Matthew stepped beside me, sliding his hand into mine. "Do you think she'll be okay?" "She already is," I said softly. We watched the last of the holiday lights flicker against the melting snow. Oliver ran through the yard, chasing the small streams forming along the edges of the porch, laughing like the world had untied itself from fear. But even as warmth settled back into our walls, a question curled quietly inside my chest, not sharp, not painful, but present. What other secrets had fear taught the people I loved to bury? The thought drifted with the melting snow. Not frightening, not threatening, just honest. A reminder that even in a good life, some truths sleep beneath the surface, waiting, watching, until the thaw brings them forward again. A first time in a long time,